So we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Tim Beechey from the University of Nottingham. And the title of Dr. Beechey's talk is Autistic Researcher Studies Normal Communication. So I must say I'm looking forward to this presentation. Just by way of background, Tim is a research fellow in hearing sciences at the University of Nottingham. Tim studied theoretical linguistics before switching fields to clinical audiology. He worked in adult hearing rehabilitation for Hearing Australia and also as a clinical specialist for a cochlear implant manufacturer. He then moved into hearing research at the National Acoustic Laboratories, where he became involved in the study of the impact of hearing impairment on conversations and completed a PhD focusing on how people accommodate to the needs of hearing impaired conversation partners. He undertook a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, focused on the role of family members in successful hearing rehabilitation before moving to the University of Nottingham to take up a fellowship to study how active behavioural strategies may aid communication in noisy situations. Most recently, he was awarded a fellowship by the University of Nottingham to study autistic adults' experiences of sound sensitivity. And Tim was diagnosed as autistic at the age of 40. So thank you for sharing that lovely bio with us, Tim. So over to you, and oftentimes feel free to take about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for Q&A following that.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. I hope that what I'm going to talk about is interesting to people. So I am an audiologist and I work in hearing sciences, but increasingly my work is moving towards studying autism, but making use of my background, having studied communication. But my experience with studying communication was somewhat accidental. And as time has gone on, I've come to realize that I view certain aspects of communication and communication research perhaps somewhat differently from other people in the fields that I've worked in. And this kind of led me to think about the way that normal communication is studied and how that actually relates to the way that communication is talked about to do with autism. So just to give you a quick overview of what I plan to talk about. So people will be aware that communication difficulty is a common aspect of autism. I'm then going to talk a bit about the way that normal conversation is often conceptualized and studied, at least in the fields that I'm familiar with. I'm going to talk about how normal conversation fits into what I'd see as the deficit view of autism. It's really quite important part of that, I would say. But then I want to go on to talk a bit about what I see as the complexity and the diversity of communication behaviors. And by that, I mean, even within a neurotypical population, the behaviors around conversation and communication are actually quite complex and interesting. Different people behave in different ways at different times. So trying to apply a simplistic view of normal conversation to autistic people becomes even maybe a bit more problematic in that sense. Throughout the talk, I guess a theme is, can an autistic researcher understand how neurotypical people communicate? So, I mean, I want to make it clear with this talk that I am not suggesting that I have the answers to these questions, but rather that I'm trying to present perhaps a bit of an outsider's view of the way these things tend to be studied, at least in the fields that I'm familiar with. And then finally, can the way that normal conversation is studied in the way that I'm going to present it, can it tell us anything about autism at all? Okay, so we know that a lot of autistic people experience difficulties with communication. So it's quite common for autistic adults to not feel particularly happy with the way that interactions go with other people. But I think it's really important to distinguish perspectives here. So there is an important distinction between the experience of an autistic person of difficulty in communication and the experience of other people's experiences of trying to communicate with autistic people. So I very much want to make clear that that the difficulties that autistic people experience with communication are real. Even if we were to take a difference rather than a deficit view of it, autistic people do experience difficulties, but the question is, where do those difficulties come from? Is it because there are things that they can't do, or is it because they do things in a way which doesn't fit with other people's expectations? So there is definitely quite a strong deficit view of autistic communication, and it essentially says that if we try to measure communication behavior of autistic people and we observe that they don't do certain things, we interpret that to mean that they can't do those things. And there's two issues with that. One is that the fact that you don't observe people to be doing those things doesn't mean that they aren't in fact doing or trying to do those things. They may just be doing these things in a way that you don't recognize. And secondly, the idea that because you don't do something means that you can't do it. It may be that someone has reasons to choose not to do something. So now it is part of the formal diagnostic criteria of autism that autistic people tend to have difficulties with conversation. And this is put quite clearly at a couple of spots within the criteria for autism, referring to failure of normal back and forth conversation. I'll also say at this point that while I'm specifically talking about autism, I think that this does relate more broadly in terms of neurodivergent individuals. But I'm going to, while acknowledging that this is not limited to autism, I'm going to limit myself to talking about autism because I don't feel that I know enough about other things to be saying too much about them. But if anybody has interest, I'd be happy to discuss those. So like I said, within DSM-5, there is mention of specifically of failure of normal back and forth conversation. So there's a quote, for example, a person who is able to speak in full sentences and engages in communication, but whose to and fro conversation with others fails. Now, as far as I'm aware, the DSM doesn't go into further detail about what is meant by this. So there's no explanation about what normal to and fro conversation is or should be. And there's also no sense in which failure is defined. So we're kind of left to interpret this in the way that people tend to, which is essentially just that autistic people are doing something wrong or failing to do something that they would need to do in order to be normal. Okay, so having talked about the identification of communication difficulties in autism, I want to now talk about how communication and conversation tend to be studied. So the most widespread way that conversation is studied is in a field known as conversation analysis. So conversation analysis originated within the field of sociology, and it is interested really in the analysis of specifically of transcripts of naturally occurring conversations. And often this takes the form of actually phone calls, which in itself is a bit of a limiting factor, because the way that people will behave in a phone call is quite different from the way that people will behave in a face-to-face interaction. But we come back to some of those limitations in a little while. The really central focus of conversation analysis is specifically on conversational turn-taking. So essentially, conversation analysts define conversation as a system of turn-taking. So define the difference between something that's conversation and something which is not conversation is that you have at least two people talking and they're taking turns. So it's the change in turns which is of interest. So how do you go from one person talking to the next person talking and back and forth? It's worthwhile to note that conversation analysis was developed in the 1970s, and it was very much a reaction at the time to formal linguistics. This is mentioned on the next slide, is important background to understand some of the shortcomings of conversation analysis. But conversation analysis essentially sets up conversation as an abstract formal system governed by specifically universal rules. So in order to have a conversation, a successful conversation, the idea is that people need to follow these rules of turn-taking, and that these rules are universal, that everybody essentially across all languages has to follow the same rules in the same way. So, like I said, conversation analysis was a reaction to formal linguistics at the time. But even though that is true, it's also true that conversational analysis inherited something from formal linguistics, which does really kind of color how we can interpret the methods that they use. So as I said, conversational analysis treats conversation as abstract, rule-based, and universal. So in linguistics, there is this important distinction between two concepts. One is called competence, the other is called performance. Now, essentially, competence is what you know about language. Performance is how you use language. And when it comes down to it, the linguists, at least the linguists in the Chomskyan tradition, they don't care about performance. They only care about competence. So this essentially leads them to reject examples of what people actually say as too messy to analyze. What they say is that what you produce when you speak is error-filled. It doesn't represent what you are actually capable of as a native speaker of a language, what you know to be the rules of grammar. So Chomsky actually refers specifically to not being interested in considering what he says are grammatically irrelevant conditions, such as memory, cognition, being different from other people, essentially. So while conversational analysis did treat conversation in terms of performance, they did come to treat it as an abstract system, which doesn't consider differences between people. And then finally, more recently, these methods have been imported into experimental fields, so such as psycholinguistics, psychology, and my own field of hearing science. So now the current situation in terms of how conversation is studied has a few kind of central tenets. One is that there is an ideal. So there is an ideal of what a good or successful conversation is. And importantly, that ideal is universal. There's only one, and it's common in all situations, all people. And importantly, this idea of universality of behavior does quite strongly imply universals of cognition. So the idea is that because we all do the same thing, supposedly our brains all must work the same way, and therefore there's a single way of being. Unlike the conversation analysts who worked qualitatively, more recently people have done this kind of analysis quantitatively. So since modern computers have made it possible to analyze digital signals, it's become possible to actually analyze the fine-grained timing of speech. And what this has led to is really the central concept now in the analysis of conversation, which is known as the floor transfer offset, which I'm going to explain in just a moment. But the important point that comes out of this is that basically the idea of what makes a good conversation is that the changes between turns are what are referred to as smooth. So a good conversation involves smooth changes between turns. Okay, so floor transfer offsets. So this is the only technical concept that I'm going to introduce. So a floor transfer offset basically tells you how much of a gap or an overlap there is between one person talking and the next. So if you look at the top blue and orange bars here, where there's no gap between them, this would mean that as one person stops talking, immediately the next person starts talking with no gap in between. So this would mean that there's zero gap. The floor transfer offset is zero. If there is some gap in time between when the first person stops talking and the second person starts, there's what is called a positive floor transfer offset. And the opposite, if the second person starts talking actually before the first person finishes, what's referred to as an overlap, then the floor transfer offset is negative. So then what people do is they take a conversation, they analyze every time there is a change of talker, and they calculate this number. And from that, they'll get a distribution. And so then on the right-hand side of the slide here, you can see an example of that for English. And what's often talked about is that this floor transfer offset is close to zero. Usually it's just very slightly above zero. So the idea is that this is what people are aiming for. But there are several conceptual issues with this. One being that the fact that what is the most common value is treated as the ideal value, and there tends to be an ignoring of the outliers as noise. So, like I said, people are said to have a specific target that they're aiming for, which is argued to be about 200 milliseconds. And differences from that 200 milliseconds are seen as deviations. They're seen as errors. Errors that are taking away from the ideal of this smooth interchange between talkers. So we might wonder why there would be any pressure to behave in this way. Why would it be important for someone to be producing, for two people to producing turn transitions at 200 milliseconds? So the idea that has been given in the literature is basically that to not do this sends some kind of message. And that message is negative. Essentially, if you don't do this, this will cause the person that you're talking to interpret that there is a problem. And even more so to interpret that that the conversation is going badly, and that will essentially snowball and cause the conversation to fail. So Stivers, the quote here, basically say that given that it's so common that people hit this target, not doing that will somehow make people think there's something wrong. So now, when people have taken these methods and applied them to conversations involving autistic people, what has been reported is that autistic people tend to leave longer gaps between turns. So, of course, because many things that autistic people are observed to do are interpreted as kind of the root of the problems of autism. These long gaps are one more thing that are considered to be a problem. And this style of turn taking is a target of interventions, for example. So there are efforts that have been made to train people to take conversational turns in a way that's considered to be normal. Okay, so just as a summary of the points that I've made so far. So, like I said, normal conversation is really defined by this idea of smooth turn taking, that the gap between talkers is not too long and it's not too short to the point where people are interrupting each other. And also that there's really only one way for things to be good and normal, and that any deviation from this norm is the cause of communication failure. Further, the assumption is that autistic people specifically can't achieve this type of normal behavior, and therefore that the way that autistic people have conversations causes those conversations to be bad or even to fail. And this, I think, is partly reflected in the statements made in the DSM in terms of the communication issues that autistic people have. Now, it's not the case that everybody agrees with this view. So there have, for example, been a small number of people within psycholinguistics who have tried to point out that this view of communication is quite limiting. So O'Connell and Cowell, in this paper you can see here in particular, they have tried to point out that if we try to define what makes a conversation good or successful, limiting ourselves to thinking about how people take turns is a bit odd. And when you think about when you have a conversation yourself, what's important is that the conversation, as O'Connell says, fulfills the purposes that you have. So if you're trying to communicate with someone, can the interaction fulfill what you're trying to achieve? And there could be multiple different things that people are trying to achieve. So the important concept here is that of purposes. So when we communicate, there's different people will have different purposes. Now, the idea of purposeful behavior is, again, quite useful here. So in psychological studies, experiments, any experimental field, there's a tendency to see people's behavior as variable and essentially that people are unpredictable, that they behave in a way that experimenters can't predict, and that introduces noise into measurements. But it has been pointed out by various people that actually what looks like random behavior is actually adaptive behavior. That people will tend to change their behavior, but they will tend to do it in a way which makes it possible to achieve a purpose that isn't changing. So, for example, in my field of study in hearing, if you're trying to hear someone and it's very noisy, you may change your behavior. So you may move closer to someone, or you may ask them to repeat themselves. And there are multiple different strategies that a person could use to achieve the same end, which is hearing what the person's saying. So we can also consider this in terms of this turn-taking behavior. So the distribution that I mentioned that centers around 200 milliseconds, but does extend positively and negatively. So everything that distribution is encompassing is an event. So there are events where someone is leaving a gap. There are events where someone is interrupting. Essentially, each of those events was triggered by or reflecting the interaction at that time. So these things shouldn't be ignored. They should be considered to be the thing that the person is doing at that time to achieve what they need to achieve or want to achieve in the conversation. But importantly, with all of human behavior, it's very rarely the case that there isn't a choice about the way you achieve something. One of the hallmarks of being human is that you can choose to solve a problem in different ways. In terms of the way that language is typically considered, like I said, conversational analysis treats conversation as turn-taking. But there is a bit of a failure to recognize that what makes conversation and the way that language works is that there is a great deal of ambiguity. So when you say something, it's very rarely the case that what you say is entirely unambiguous. If you've ever had the experience of sending a text message and feeling the need to put in an emoji to make it clear that what you're saying is, for example, positive or negative, then you've had the experience that the literal string of words can be interpreted in very different ways. So it's important to note that while autistic people are, I guess, blamed for not being able to interpret language the way that other people do, it is the case that language is always open to interpretation, and it is only through the back and forth between people who are cooperating that it's possible to actually establish meaning without ambiguity. So I want to make the point that this theory of conversational turn-taking doesn't account for the range of normal behaviors. Even if we're not yet thinking about autistic people, but even neurotypical people, they do exhibit behaviors that are much less neat, if you want to put it that way. So, for example, different individuals have different communication styles and preferences. Some people like to take their time. Some people like to jump in and ask lots of questions. There's really no single way of being. The other thing that's important to consider is that temporal aspects of speech. So, for example, how much of a gap you leave or whether you interrupt someone, these things do carry information. So if the goal is to eliminate, for example, gaps and overlaps in order to achieve smooth turn-taking, then we would lose any information that would be signaled by these things. And one of the really central things that is signaled is the cognitive state of the talker at the time. So if I'm speaking like I am now, I don't actually know 5, 3, 6 words ahead what's going to come out of my mouth. I know essentially what I want to say, but I have not kind of rehearsed the words in a string. So while I'm talking, I'm thinking. And any pause, any change in my intonation, any disfluencies in my speech are a fairly direct window into my cognitive processes as I'm speaking. So to want to kind of sanitize speech to make it nice and neat is to deny the importance and the usefulness of that information, and to deny that the way that we communicate actually is to gather that information. Of course, also, we work differently in different contexts. So if you're with a friend in a cafe and you're having a conversation and you don't speak for several seconds because you're drinking your coffee or looking out the window, it's unlikely that your friend is going to decide that the conversation is failing. So it's important to consider that this idea of things must fit into this neat abstract pattern can't be applied actually to most situations we find ourselves in. So if it is the case that this theory can't account for neurotypical conversation, how should we think about autistic conversation within this lens that is applied to autistic people. So now, the other question is, of course, when you have two or more autistic people talking to each other, as opposed to an autistic person communicating with a neurotypical person, what might happen? If we accepted the position that autistic people essentially lack awareness or the capability to communicate effectively, to understand themselves or to understand other people, we'd expect that problems would be multiplied when you have two autistic people talking to each other. But in reality, what we tend to find is that conversations between autistic people go about as well as conversations between neurotypical people. So in this study, Worley et al., they looked at pairwise conversations, so pairs of two autistic people, pairs of two neurotypical people, and they really found very little difference in terms of this floor transfer offset measure. You can see that there is just a very slight difference. So in the blue distribution, there's a bit more happening in the positive floor transfer offset. So that says that autistic people may be leaving slightly more gaps, but the difference is really very small. Now, to the authors' credit in this study, they looked a bit deeper, and what they found is that if you consider what people are doing at the beginning of the conversation compared to the rest of the conversation, autistic people were behaving somewhat differently in that they were leaving larger gaps, specifically at the beginning. But towards the end of the conversation, there was much less difference between the autistic and the neurotypical conversations. Now, in this study and others like it, there is still a tendency to say, to treat this as a deficit. So these authors did conclude that autistic people ended up behaving like neurotypical people, but the deficit is it took them longer to achieve it. Whereas I think the more interesting and useful way to consider it is that autistic people here are exhibiting different behavior in different contexts. In the context where they're first having this conversation, and this conversation, by the way, is what's called a map task. So they're solving a puzzle together. At the beginning of this conversation, they're interacting in a way which is perhaps slower and more cautious. But then as time goes on, their behavior is looking more like the neurotypical people's. So I think it's a useful thing to consider that it's not necessarily a bad thing for your behavior to change as the situation changes. And then as a final point, I'd just like to point out that as there is a deficit view of autistic communication, there also tends to be often quite stereotyped views of autistic communication. And sometimes this leads to situations which are a bit absurd. So, for example, in the UK, there was a move to change the driving license requirements for autistic people until it was pointed out that everybody does pass a driver's license test, and the best way to know whether autistic people are impaired in their driving would be that driving test. In Australia, though, they did actually go ahead and implement this requirement. And so it now is the case in various states that autistic people need to undergo additional driving tests. And the ABC interviewed one of the people who authored this change. And I found it quite interesting that one of the reasons given was this idea that autistic people may have difficulty understanding the non-verbal communication of other drivers. But when you think about this, it's actually one of the situations where we're least likely to be needing to rely on non-verbal communication. The way that people drive is essentially following quite specific rules. So we don't need to figure out what a person is thinking when they're driving. It's a matter of taking things quite literally, something that autistic people are often accused of. So when we accept overly simple explanations about communication, there can be real life consequences for people. So for example, people in Australia are avoiding autism diagnoses because they know it will affect their ability to drive. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, Tim, for a really insightful presentation. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it's a different topic, actually, and it's a topic addressed from, I think, a unique angle. And in research, if people can add to the knowledge base by exploring something which has not been given necessarily sufficient attention in the past, I think that's a real contribution. So we're going to have some questions, and I'll start with a question. If you want, you can take down your presentation. But one of the first questions I would ask is just at the very end. I found it quite startling and surprising and concerning. You know, the idea of autistic people being mandated to take additional driving instruction. Um, Now, I entirely promote the concept of safe roads, but this is the first time I've ever heard any association between autism and driving, and I'd be worried that it seems quite discriminatory. Do you have
Mm.
any additional views on that?
Sorry, could you just say that last?
Oh, yeah. I'd be worried that it appears quite discriminatory, that, you know, there's discrimination really, towards autistic people, because it's certainly not a concept I've heard before
Mhm.
around driving.
So um, I I have looked a little bit at studies to do with autism and driving, and I think like many things with autism, when you look at it, the picture is complicated. So there does seem to be evidence that autistic people are better in certain ways on average. For example, they are more likely to follow rules. They're more likely to do things in a methodical way. There does appear to be some evidence that some autistic individuals may experience more difficulties with kind of distraction, for example. But I mean, overall, I think, what I'd say is that if we stop looking because we found an answer which seems kind of simplistically satisfying, like you don't understand non-verbal cues, if we stop there, then that's not helping anybody. So I mean, I don't believe that there's a issue with autistic drivers, but if there were, we're not going to find it by pointing out issues with non-verbal communication.
Hmm. Hmm. For sure. And I know there's some questions from others, so definitely we'll turn our attention to those now. But the whole issue around nonverbal communication is certainly so deficit based that it seems reductive and unhelpful. But over to other people. I see a question here from Fondo Hassan, and Fondo states applied behavior analysis plays a critical role in managing challenging behavior among learners with autism. Narrowing down, how would you help a learner who is always very restless and rarely he settles in class? Which specific principle or model will help? Have managed to use the ABC model, but it doesn't really help.
So I mean, there may be other people here who can have a more informed answer to that. I don't have any experience myself with that kind of behavioral intervention, and I would suggest that it's not. So some of my work, for example, has tried to address the question of training people to change their behavior when it comes to communication. But I think the point I've tried to make in this talk is that rather than changing the way that an autistic person behaves, we should consider whether the way they're behaving is telling us something, and whether it is within actually a range of diversity of behavior, which is okay, except for the conventions that we've kind of set up for what should be considered to be normal. So in that sense, I would be cautious about adopting any behavioral intervention in terms of the way that people communicate. That's not to say that people should not be given communicative supports when they need them. They absolutely should, but it shouldn't be the case that people need to conform to an ideal.
Okay, and thank you, Tim, for the answer. Ken?
Just thanks very much for the presentation. I have to say I found it interesting myself. Just could I just make a personal question just for myself, to be honest? Say we have a son at home who's 27 who would be autistic. Just going back to your experience in audiology. From an early age, even when he at an early age, if he was in a play setting, you could whisper his name 50 feet away and he'd hear it. At the moment, when we're downstairs with the television on, if we were to talk about him, he would come down 30 seconds later saying, "Were you talking about me?" So I know it's not particularly autistic, but because there's a lot of sensitivity around perceptions or things like hearing, sight, and things like that as well. So would that be better hearing or just more sensitive hearing?
Yeah, so there is quite a lot of literature looking at extremely good sound sensitivity in autistic people. It is often much better than normal. It is also the case that this is quite variable. So that someone has good hearing sensitivity may also go along with, in certain situations, that they appear not to be paying attention, for example, that they may not respond. So, for example, my daughter, who is autistic, also is similar to what you described. She will hear something from the next room, but sometimes you talk to her and she doesn't respond. You have to kind of really try very hard to get her attention. It's also the case that for a lot of autistic people, there is sound sensitivity. It is I think an open question whether sound sensitivity, so discomfort with sound, goes along with the being able to hear very soft sounds. My own work that I've started recently would suggest that is very contextual. So, for example, some people who report being very bothered by loud sound may also self-soothe, for example, by listening to loud music. So I guess to answer your question, yes, I have certainly observed, and I've heard many people saying that autistic people have very good sound sensitivity. But what the bigger picture of that is unclear, because I think it's very context dependent.
Okay, well, thanks for that. There's a question came in from Anne, and this is the question that I've been thinking about since you started your presentation. So I let Anne phrase it better than I can. So Anne is saying, "I loved your presentation. Thanks for your doing it. My question is, as a speech and language therapist, I recognize that many people need additional time to process what has been spoken when in a conversation. Did the research consider processing time and considering delay in responding to other speakers?"
So, good point. So, I mean, the studies that look at floor transfer offsets do not typically consider something like that. So, but it is certainly the case that, so for example, when in a hearing clinic, we test someone's hearing, and we do that by playing, say, a sentence, and then the person should repeat the sentence back, and the next sentence will begin kind of automatically a few seconds later. And so it's quite common that someone will not be able to accurately repeat what they heard, but then it will kind of come to them a few seconds later, but then it's too late. So it definitely is the case that there is this kind of processing time. So whenever we try to measure something behaviorally, we do need to consider whether we're measuring behavior or perception. So when we try to measure perception by someone, for example, repeating something back, we have to remember that they're not telling us what they actually heard. They're telling us the outcome of this cognitive process. So I hear something and then I tell you what I heard, but it may not literally be what I heard. It's what I figured out what I heard. So in that sense, allowing that time. So that would be one of the things I would like to be there to be more awareness of, is that if you're having a conversation with someone and they are a bit slower to respond, to not jump to the conclusion of the conversation is going badly or the person is being rude, but rather they're thinking, they're processing. That's what that person needs to do.
Just within that, if I just delve just a little bit deeper into it, because when I'm doing presentations, particularly around ADHD, the analogy that I would ask the audience to use is, I'm near Dublin Airport, and there's all the planes coming in and out, and there's someone regulating that. And that if you imagine the brain of someone with ADHD is the Dublin Airport or Gatwick or Heathrow, and when the air traffic controllers doesn't come in and there's all these planes going around and around, when you ask them the question, they need to take whatever it is just to process that time to get that executive functioning so they can answer the question for you. But again, I would know that executive functioning would cross over autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD. So where do you see executive functioning fitting into the greater model in terms of the models you're presenting for language?
So so again, this is not, so executive function is something that is very much not considered within the theories that I talked about. So because, like I said, the idea is this kind of idealized person. So, when I was in linguistics, people would say quite explicitly, we don't care about what they would call disordered populations, because someone who is not, quote, normal is not therefore a good exemplar of what a human is supposedly capable of in this kind of universalist view of language. And therefore, someone with ADHD, autism, schizophrenia would be not considered to be a worthy person to study, because they would produce what would be considered to be performance as opposed to competence. So in that sense, I mean, and it's, it sounds awful, and it is quite awful, but that is what linguists are interested in. They're interested in cognitive universals that are idealized. When you take those ideas and put them into fields that involve either perception or allied health, for example, where you're actually dealing with real people, to try to stick to those ideals or to not understand where those concepts came from, I think is very problematic. But I think it is under-recognized.
Okay, thanks. There's a question in there from Natalie, and says, thanks for your eloquent presentation, Dr. Beechley. And she was just wondering, in terms of your research, she asked, it's quite a long question. I'm not sure if you want to read it yourself or to me to read it out for you, but really a question about the use of controls in terms of your research.
In terms of how you would control a conversational experiment?
No, the controls, as in what would the makeup of the controls?
Sorry,
how neuro and culturally diverse were the control and ASE participants and individuals eliminated?
So I mean, so I do want to make it clear that the studies I'm reporting are not my own studies. So I'm not sure about some of the details. When I have studied conversation myself, I mean, it is always the case that people are doing convenience sampling. So there is always quite a lot of variation in those things. But in terms of the results that I presented, I couldn't honestly answer exactly what that detail is. Because, yeah.
Just in terms of the universality of what you were talking about, this is the conversation I was having last night. In terms of we were talking about, neurodiversity and the populations that make up that. And the point we would be making in the conversation last night was that that in fact neurodivergence actually includes neurotypicals as well. So therefore the concept of university would apply equally to everybody within the subsets that you were talking about.
Yes, so I mean, I agree with that. I guess that makes me think of, as a autistic person who kind of found myself somewhat accidentally studying conversation in non-autistic populations, that has led me to think quite a lot about, this idea between difference and deficit. So, I mean, obviously, on one hand, we can place everyone on a continuum and say that, the difficulties that I, as an autistic person, have are just maybe a slightly more amplified version of the difficulties that everybody has. Versus there's something just fundamentally that an autistic person can't do, versus the way that we all do things is valid. It's just that the problem arises because some people are not going to accept the way that autistic people do things to be valid. I don't honestly know what the right answer to that is, because, I find myself certainly thinking that a lot of what autistic people do in terms of conversation should not be viewed as problematic. It should be viewed as part of this continuum. But I equally don't want to deny the difficulties that autistic people do have, if that makes sense.
No, I say no. We're here to have the conversation and to broach these themes. There's a question in from Gabby. I'm currently in sociology research regarding autistic people's experiences, and constructing interviews. So, would you have any tips on how to make the interview easier on the autistic interviewees? For example, should I give them more time to answer, or should I alter the interviewing process myself? And if it helps, I'm ND myself.
I mean, I think flexibility is I guess the main thing, that each individual is going to be somewhat different. But yes, I mean, for sure, allowing more time. But in terms of, the timing, as I've talked about it in conversations, I mean, we're talking about small amounts of time. We're talking about the fact that someone takes 500 milliseconds instead of 80 milliseconds may cause someone to think that that person is rude. So, I mean, the differences are actually quite small, but I mean, it is also the case, as you mentioned, that some people do need processing time. And so, I mean, I think that the message that I would give to people is just, if you perceive that someone is behaving in a way that you think is negative, not interested, or not happy in some way, don't jump straight to that conclusion, because it might just be that what you're interpreting as these cues are actually something about the person doing the process that they're trying to do.
Just a couple questions. Just before we get back to them, there was one other question that crossed my mind during your presentation, and at the end there when you're talking about driving licenses. And one of the challenges where language and communication may come up, particularly for autistic people, we have seen is in the court system, whereby they are seen to be not able to communicate. Eye contact, maybe less, things like that. So, do you have any insight into how that would work for people with autism?
So I'm certainly not a specialist in terms of that, but I mean, what I can tell you is that people make judgments, often quite definitive judgments, about people on the basis of these cues that they perceive. So, when we perceive speech, we do perceive cues to do with how confident the person is, how kind of forthright or honest the person is being, whether the person is being friendly or unfriendly. So, I mean, it's possible to draw all sorts of quite strong conclusions about a person based on our interpretation of certain cues, like, for example, pausing. And so, yes, I mean, that could certainly have real implications for a person if they were judged to be being dishonest, for example, because they paused for half a second before answering a question, as opposed to, well, I'm trying to remember to make sure I tell you the accurate answer.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, well, thanks very much for that. Just another question in terms from Natalie. Have you considered including people with dual or multiple neuropsychic conditions within the context of your co-produced presentational research? Will BMA and BIPOC communities also be included from an ND and NT perspectives?
So, I mean, yeah, I do believe that it is important to not limit ourselves to a small subset, even within, say, the autistic population, because we can't guess at the experiences of a person without talking to that person. So certainly in the research that I do and plan to do in the future, the intention is to include all people.
Ooh, thanks. I don't know if Timmy wants to jump in there. Or
Sure. Yeah, we'll take another 5 minutes and finish up after that. A question here from Dr. Radha Balachandar. Can you give some more details about floor transfer offsets?
Yeah, so like I said, the floor transfer offset is it's a single number which essentially collapses the idea of a pause between turns and an overlap. So like I said, if you have a positive floor offset, it means that there was a gap. Negative, it means there was and people were talking at the same time. But it is important to consider that what causes a gap and what causes an overlap are quite different things. So the way that people have actually taken these things and put them into a single distribution, like I showed that distribution with the peak, essentially says that this is all coming from the same source. That the difference between a gap and an overlap is just where you are along that continuum, that you could turn an overlap into a gap somehow, which in my way of thinking denies or ignores the fact that what causes someone to pause is an entirely independent process from what may cause someone to interrupt. And so it's essentially a convenience of the analyst to treat them in this way. And it does then have these implications that anything that deviates from that most common value is considered to be a deviation, an error, that what we are kind of aiming for is that central value. Whereas in reality, these studies quite often record these floor transfer offsets on the basis of quite limited types of interaction. So, for example, the Stiver study that I presented, they specifically only took yes/no question answer pairs. So it was a situation where there was a question and someone answered it yes or no. So not only could they answer with just a yes or a no, but they did. So that means the type of thinking or processing that you might need to do to answer a different type of question is not in that distribution.
Okay.
Can I just ask one more quick one? Just a question from Gabby there. I think it's just interesting. Is there any consideration about masking, camouflaging in the research on autistic communication?
Mm-hmm.
And then with it, can I just ask you a quick, and then just as a B for that for me, in terms of your offset transfers, is there any difference between men and women?
So in terms of men and women, so I mean, there are studies looking at kind of gender differences and cultural differences of communication behavior. There are certainly reports that that different genders and different cultures do this differently. But having said that, the Stiver study actually, quite the point of the Stiver study that I reported is that they looked at all these different languages and they found the same thing. And so they concluded this is universal.
Yes, sir.
But like I said, they only looked at yes/no questions. So, I mean, I think it is the case that people who are different may well behave differently. They may well have a different norm, but also will act differently in different contexts and therefore will end up overlapping quite a lot. In terms of the question of masking, I mean, I think it's very important to consider that if if one takes the approach of kind of that what we should do is train people to behave in a way that is normal, which would allow them, say, to have more positive conversations with people, we do run the risk of having them hide the difficulties that they have, which one just means that they deal with that later, that you still have the fatigue, you have potentially even more fatigue and cognitive overload from having to do that masking. But secondly, then people say, oh, what's the problem? Because you had that conversation fine, and now you're telling me that you find this difficult, but I don't believe you because you're clearly capable of doing this. So because autism is defined in terms of outward behavior, if we tell people to hide the outward behavior, then what sometimes seems to happen is denial of services, because now they're not exhibiting the outward behavior. But telling them to change their behavior didn't change anything about their brain.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Sorry, Ken. We just have time. Let's try to squeeze in another 2 questions, and then we'll likely have to finish up. So Jacob has asked, I know that you mentioned difficulty with distraction. How would you differentiate between autism and ADHD when it comes to this, say in relation to conversation?
So like I said, I'm not an expert on ADHD. I'm aware that, for example, the DSM points to people with ADHD interrupting, jumping, like answering a question before the person has finished asking the question. In terms of distraction, I mean, I think that from what I have read, I think that it's potentially more of an issue in ADHD than autism, but I don't feel qualified to really answer that question.
Okay. And the final one from me, and then if Ken has anything else to add, we see here Danny Burns has asked, will the built environment have an impact?
The built environment certainly has an impact on communication, particularly in terms of noise and reverberation. So there is a tendency, for example, for restaurants to be constructed with a lot of hard surfaces. And also that I think it's kind of thankfully started to go away, but there was a big trend in Australia, I don't know about in Ireland, to construct open plan school classrooms. So having, like, say 4 or even 6 classrooms with no walls in between them. And so I know from hearing aid clinic that a lot of people don't go to restaurants because they can't hear, because the hard surfaces means that there's so much reverberation. So in terms of conversation, and autistic people do certainly struggle more in noise than neurotypical people. So we were talking earlier about good hearing sensitivity, but that actually does go along with poorer hearing and noise. So there is some potentially some issue with kind of adapting to noise. So when the noise is changing, so when the noise is modulated, that's much more difficult for autistic people than when there is the same amount of noise, but it's just steady. So in that modulated situation, they do worse than neurotypical people. So yes, anything that creates noise, and particularly reverberation, would cause more difficulty for autistic people, given the same degree of hearing than neurotypical people.
Okay, and Ken, any
No,
further?
just to say, no, thank you very much. I want to say thanks to Tim for coming along today and answering all the questions.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And just to say again, a big thank you to Dr. Tim Beechey from the University of Nottingham, presenting research on, well, what we certainly feel is quite a novel and underexplored area. So thank you for your time, Tim. Thank you as well to all of the participants for joining us. Just to flag next month's talk. So it's Thursday, the 25th of April at 5 p.m. Irish time, and we have Anna Justine. Pardon me. So Chaka, Sochacka, and she is a neurodiversity advocate, and she will be talking about the neurodiversity movement online, challenging the norm, language, community, and resistance. So again, quite varied topics. So hopefully we'll see as many people as possible next month. And to those of you who may celebrate Easter, have a nice Easter weekend. And indeed, I hope everyone has a nice Easter weekend. So thanks very much. Good evening. See you again soon.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.